So, hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Book Cafe podcast. In today's episode, we will be discussing this book right here behind me entitled Jinnah A Life by Yasser Latif Hamdani. As a lot of our viewers and listeners will know, that Mr. Jinnah is a titanic figure in history, especially South Asian history. And I'm extremely thrilled to have the author himself to talk about the book in today's episode. So before we get into that, let me first introduce the author, Barrister Yasser Latif Hamdani. Hi, Yasser. Welcome to Book Cafe podcast.
Hi, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Now, Yasser, we will get to your book in a minute, but for our viewers and listeners who haven't read the book and who may be discovering you for the very first time, do please take a moment to tell us a little bit more about yourself, your education background, where you grew up, what you do for a living, in fact, anything at all that you'd like to share with us.
hmm I was born and raised in Lahore. I went to school there, then I went to college in the US at Rutgers in New Jersey, and which plays, by the way, plays a very important part in why I wrote this. Come to it in a minute, I'm sure. I did my law after I came back, and then subsequently, very late in life, I also was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn. So that's my educational background. In terms of what I do, I'm a lawyer. I do a lot of freedom of expression and speech cases. I do a lot of constitutional law cases. I do corporate work. So that sort of thing. But yes, also writing as well. That's something that I do. And as far as other things are concerned, I have two beautiful daughters, and this book was kind of dedicated to them as well. So
Yeah, yes, fantastic. So, while reading the book, I came across something very interesting right in the beginning. You were responsible for getting YouTube unbanned from Pakistan, and that is a really mind-blowing thing to do. So, would you mind just taking a moment to tell us a little bit about how that happened and what was going on? Just to tell us what was the milieu in which that event took place, and how long ago did that take place?
well, in 2012, and this was back when that blasphemous film came on YouTube. I don't know if you remember. It was a blasphemous anti-Islam movie, film, or video, whatever you want to call it. In response to that, the government of Pakistan had blocked YouTube all across Pakistan, so you didn't have any access to YouTube, and this ban remained there for 3.5 years. Basically, what we did, my civil society organization, challenged the ban on constitutional grounds, and we spoke about freedom of expression and speech. Pakistani constitution is very interesting, as you can imagine. I mean, it is an Islamic republic, and it is de facto theocratic state. I would call it a theocratic state. That's something I'm sure we'll talk about a bit as well. But it does give freedom of expression and speech, but that is limited by glory of Islam. And so that's where the case was. My case was that having YouTube does not, and believe it or not, this is as hilarious as it gets. We were talking about how freedom of expression and speech is central to Islamic ideals and Islamic law, and that's what sort of we argued. We also argued that freedom of expression is such a fundamental human right, especially under the ICCPR, which is Pakistan's ratified as part of its international obligations. So that's what we argued. The case went on for 3.5 years. It went on too long. Ultimately, the government decided to unblock YouTube under pressure from the courts.
Mhm. Mhm. Wow. Well, that's quite an amazing story, and I think that a lot of YouTubers in Pakistan, and of course, since we're recording this, I'm quite sure that there will be an audience for this particular episode in Pakistan as well as Bangladesh. And so, yeah, we have you to thank for that for having gotten YouTube unbanned. So, Yasser, moving on to the book itself. With regards to Mr. Jinnah, he is, of course, a very revered figure in Pakistan. And yet, just across the border in India, he's also seen as a very divisive figure. So, my first question to you would be that even though there are a lot of books that have been written previously about Mr. Jinnah, what exactly was your motivation for writing, another book on somebody whom the world probably knows a lot about and has read about, over the last 70 plus years. So, what exactly was your motivation for having to write this particular book on Mr. Jinnah?
Yeah, I think Jinnah is a very misunderstood figure, and not just in India for that matter. I mean, India obviously sees him as someone who divided the country, divided the motherland, and vivisected it, as they like to say. But also in Pakistan, where he's seen as this uh, multi. It's not he's not seen in his multi dimensions, but he's seen as someone who is sort of singularly focused on getting Pakistan and making it an Islamic state. That is a narrative that needed to be challenged. I think my own journey started back at Rutgers in New Jersey, where I got into a lot of debates with my Indian friends, and also with a lot of Pakistani friends about why Pakistan was created in the first place. So that's where Jinnah comes up as such a sore thumb, if you think about it, in the officially accepted nationalist mythologies of Pakistan and India. The man was the only politician to be called the best ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity for most of his life, and he had a long political career, right from 1906 to 1947. If you think about it, it's 41 years, and out of those 41 years, 30 odd years, more than 30 years, 32, 33 years were spent fighting for a united India. And he was very committed to a united India. He called himself, and he famously said that he's an Indian first, second, and last. So, how was it that a man of that bent or that way of thinking, how did he end up making a separate state for Muslims of the subcontinent? Why into a partitionist at the very end of his life? And I think that's a question that needs to be answered. So I've tried to answer that. I mean, there have been other great books. Aisha Jalal, Soul Spokesman, for example, has tried to answer that question and has done so very well. Except I have now taken all of his life in one holistic sort of manner, and have gone from right from his sort of because remember, Jinnah was a triple minority.
Hmm.
He was a triple minority because not only was he a Muslim minority in the subcontinent, but he was a Shia minority, and within the Shias, he was born into the Ismaili household, minority,
Hmm.
and that played an important part in sort of his mental makeup, and which consequently led to his sort of basically what he wanted was safeguard for religious minorities as well as other minorities. And I think that is something that came right from the beginning. So in my book, I spent some time talking about the Shia divide, for example, and within the intra-Shia divide as well as the inter-Muslim divide, as it were. So I've tried to talk about that as well. But also, I think Jinnah needed to be explained, not just for the sort of, I mean, it's not just an academic issue for me. As a lawyer, politician, he had such an impact. Obviously, as you know, he was, like you said, he was a titanic figure. I think as a citizen of Pakistan, I believe that my country, especially given the place that we are at, and unfortunately we are not at a place that we would sort of be, or anyone could be proud of. Pakistan is a theocratic state which is plagued with religious fundamentalism. So I think explaining Jinnah and his motivation in terms of ideology, in terms of what he wanted, was very important. So my book speaks to that. It speaks to that particular that is there, and I don't think there is scholarship in Pakistan that has attempted to do that, because Jinnah, by the way, there are PhDs that are in Pakistan. You would be surprised to know that PhD on Jinnah's life is discussed. In fact, you can't. No university allows you to in Pakistan. No university actually allows you to do PhD on Jinnah's life
Hmm.
in Pakistan. So there is a dearth of
Hmm.
scholarship in Pakistan on Jinnah. But my own book is also a political act. I am attempting to set the record straight, and
Hmm.
that is the reason I wrote the book.
Hmm. Wow, it's very interesting. And yeah, I did not know that people weren't allowed to do PhDs on Mr. Jinnah in Pakistan. So that is quite the eye opener. Now, Yasser, let's pivot back to Mr. Jinnah's early life. And from later on in life, and I can see that you have a picture of Mr. Jinnah right next to you, where he looks really dapper in his suits and his ties, and later on in life, his sherwanis. So he gives the impression as a man who comes from a very well-to-do family and aristocratic background, for example. But was that really the case? Was that the kind of family he came from?
He was not from an aristocratic family. His father was a businessman, a hide merchant, as it were.
Mm,
He was an up and coming businessman. He had links with the British. He was, sort of an upper middle class uh, background for that time. He was pretty much a middle class person. Came from a business family, was from a business caste, as you know. He was a Khoja, Gujarati Khoja. So he was not an aristocrat. And if you even meet their family today, you find them not very aristocratic, but rather very middle class. So
mm,
Jinnah's background itself was quite from within sort of that business oriented uh, petty bourgeois
mm,
that were sort of dominating Karachi at that point. So I think Jinnah was not from an aristocratic, but remember he did when you talk about his suits and sort of his lifestyle. He
mm,
made all his money on his own, and that is part of his remarkable achievement. I mean, he rose from a point where he was penniless for the longest time. He at one point you would be surprised to know that at one point he was playing snooker and in Bombay to make money.
mm,
So he would bet on snooker and make money because he didn't have any briefs. Nobody would hire him as a lawyer for the longest time. It was only subsequently with hard work that he became a very successful lawyer, perhaps the most of his time. But for a long time, he rose from that sort of level and then came to a point where at one point all the aristocrats of the Muslim community in India, as well as Maharajas and Rajas, were coming to him for legal advice and him for political leadership as well. So yeah, that is the achievement of the man.
mm. Absolutely, yeah, and I think that speaks volume for who he is as a self-made man to be able to present himself in the way that he did and be able to engage with high rollers, etc. So yeah, that really is wonderful. Now, Yasser, just before we leave this particular section with regards to Mr. Jinnah's background and his childhood, and just before he takes off for England, I do have one question which will be a little self-serving, but it is something that I was extremely surprised to find. Um, Mr. Jinnah was an apprentice at a company known as Graham's Trading Company, and through some strange twist of history, I believe that that company went on to become Turner Graham's Pakistan Limited, and it had and it was present in both eastern East Pakistan as well as West Pakistan. And so I happen to, I'm a YouTuber and podcaster. I moonlight as a YouTuber and podcaster, but in my day job, I'm a full-time sales director, and I happen to be a director in this company called Turner Graham's. And so my staff will be extremely upset with me if I don't ask you at least this question about is there anything more you can tell us about Mr. Jinnah's time with Turner Graham slash Graham's Trading Company and how he fared there and how long he stayed as an apprentice and what eventually happened and why he left? Yeah.
Well, I think that is a very key part of our puzzle in Jinnah's story, because when we see what happened, his father sent him to basically apprentice with the Graham Trading Company. That was something that was the kind of career that was planned out for him. He was going to go there, get business experience, come back and work with his father on the business.
Mhm,
But Jinnah, being sort of this independent-minded person, decided when in England to switch over from business to law. And interestingly, before he switched over to law, he actually went into for a while. So he tried to become a Shakespearean actor. He was actually selected for the part of Romeo But his father actually said, no, you're going to, this is going to be such a shame for the family, so don't do it. And ultimately that's what he did. He didn't get into acting, but got into law instead. But as far as Graham Trading Company is concerned, he was pretty much, that's the reason why he went to England. He was not earmarked to go into law, as it were,
Mm.
or into acting for that matter.
Right.
He did both later.
Mm.
As you can imagine, I mean, Jinnah was this great lawyer, politician, and actor as well, because he loved the drama of the courtroom. But he started off, the things that he did take from that, I think, are very important. The
Mm.
man had a great business acumen. So that's something that he did all throughout his life. He was,
Mm.
in major companies, owned parts of newspapers, parts of, and ironically, or maybe not so ironically, in 1947 he bought shares of Air India as well. So I think all of that kind of goes back to, sort of his training in Graham's Trading Company,
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's
which,
amazing.
by the things, it was, I think it was not just in construction, but was also into sort of hides and that sort of thing.
Right, right, absolutely. Wow, that's amazing. Usually, whenever I'm reading a book, I always feel, it's like on the outside looking in, very detached from the subject I'm reading about. But this is probably the first instance where I could find myself connected somehow to the subject that I was talking about. So, yes, thank you so much for that bit of information and for indulging me, as well as our entire staff at Turner Graham's, who'd be really thrilled to know that it had at least a small part to play in the outlook of Mr. Jinnah later on in life. So, Yasser, now coming to Mr. Jinnah's political ideology, a lot of times historians are able to neatly divide his ideology into pre 1937 Jinnah and post 1937 Jinnah. So, would you be able to tell us a little bit more about, and you obviously already alluded to it a little bit during the first question, calling him the ambassador of Hindu Muslim unity. So do tell us a little, let's deep dive a little bit into that. Please tell us more about Mr. Jinnah's 1937 ideology and where he stood with regards to the entire political spectrum.
Well, see, Muslims, when they, in response to what was going on with sort of the political developments, one of the things that Sir Syed Ahmed Khan told Muslims was, don't join the Congress party. Because Congress party dominated, you're going to be outnumbered by the Hindus. The democratic process is ultimately going to lead you and marginalize you, and sort of lead you to a position where you would become second class citizens. So this was Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. Jinnah actually didn't come from that.
Hmm. Right.
From the get-go, supported the Congress and became part of the Congress, and was and contributed to it both financially and as as an active member of the party. So Jinnah was coming from very much that school of thought, which said, no, we are Indians, we should be Indians, and there's no difference between Hindus and Muslims, difference that is. And that is something that he stood by for a very long time. There are several things. There's an interview that he gave to a select committee, as it were, of the British Parliament, in which he said that in time, very soon, he expected all distinctions between Muslims and Hindus to vanish.
Mhm.
So Jinnah basically believed, as I said earlier, he believed that he was an Indian first, second, and last. To him, religion was a very secondary issue. Other than the fact that his name was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, there was hardly anything Muslim about him. He was not someone who was into Islamic rituals. They didn't dress like, particularly dressed like a Muslim. I mean, he was this uh, turn of the century gentleman, Edwardian gentleman, as you can imagine, very, as you said, dapper in his suits and stuff. Married a Parsi, as you know. So all of that, Jinnah was pretty much, the only thing Muslim about him was the fact that he ultimately was elected on a Muslim constituency, and that is why he maintained that sort of link. And sought to speak for the Muslim minority, as it were. But till 1937, he was trying to come up with what is known as a consociational solution.
Mhm.
So he led the major push for Lucknow Pact, as you know,
Mhm.
where he brought Hindus and Muslims together. This is given the title Hindus Best Ambassador of Hindu-Muslim Unity by Sarojini Naidu. And Gokhale said that earlier as well. Jinnah had that, he was made of that stuff which would bring Hindu Muslim unity permanent. So I think, but what is central to this entire thing we see in the pre 1937 phase is Jinnah's belief that in order for there to be an independence, in order for there to be free, Hindus and Muslims have to come together at all costs. And by all costs, he meant the Hindus could give safeguards to Muslims, and Muslims could agree to give up certain things that they had. For example, the majorities in Punjab and Bengal, Jinnah was ready to give up. He was ready to give up electoral majorities in Punjab and Bengal so long as minorities in the rest of the subcontinent would get a certain number of seats which were in excess to their numbers as a whole. So I think that was Jinnah's sort of objective, was to come to a contractual arrangement, and I would call it a contractual arrangement between Hindus and Muslims, whereby they could agree to form or create a basis for an Indian nation that would be not just sort of colorblind but blind. So I think that was what he was attempting to do. After 1937, as you know, he moved towards sort of the Sir Syed Ahmed Khan thesis, as it were. Khan believed that Congress, would, as Sir Syed Ahmed Khan had famously said, that Congress would ultimately come and dominate Muslims and would outnumber them 3-1. That is something that Jinnah came 1937. So he pretty much moved from this secular Indian nationalist to a Muslim nationalist, as it were, and that became the basis of his famous two-nation theory. Two-nation theory, interestingly, was also a consociationalist theory. So if you recall, Jinnah did with the cabinet mission plan, he did accept a united India even as late as 1946. So one neat division that historians get into, they forget that till 1946, Jinnah was ready to come to an arrangement on the basis of united India. So the question of how far he wanted, how much he wanted a separate and sovereign Pakistan, that is a question that remains to be answered, because when we look at the facts are that Jinnah was ready to settle for something less than a complete partition.
Well, that's really really interesting, and I think that with regards to anybody's story, you have the beginning and then you have the end, and then sometimes the details, the finer details in the middle, get glossed over or ignored altogether. So I think that that was one of the things I really loved about the book, where you were able to extract all the details of the granular details and be able to present it in a way that is so easy for any lay reader or lay historian to be able to go through. So yes, thank you so much for that. Now, Yasser, just backtracking a little bit from 1937, let's go back to 1906 and the formation of the All India Muslim League, which happened to be in Dhaka at the time. But as you rightly point out, Mr. Jinnah didn't actually join the league until 1913, right? So, what was the reason for that 7-year gap between the formation of the league? Because at the end of the day, when we think of Mr. Jinnah, we always assume that he was probably a member of the league right from the very beginning, but that wasn't the case. So, what was the reason for that 7-year gap between 1906 and 1913, the year of his joining?
Well, when in 1906 the Muslim League was made, Jinnah actually denounced it. He said this is British perfidy, that there's an attempt to divide Indians on the basis of religion. So Jinnah actually came out very strongly against not just the Muslim League, but against the Shimla deputation. Now, I don't know if you remember what Shimla deputation was. There's a bunch of to the viceroy and said, these are our demands, give us separate electorates and the like, and give us, the special representation. This was obviously the Sir Syed Ahmed Khan school of
Mhm.
thought, sort of a solution where Muslims would find adequate and effective representation within the legislative councils. So Jinnah pretty much opposed it. He thought that the entire Muslim League project was basically an attempt by the British to undermine and undercut the Congress party. Something, by the way, that he was accused of later on, as
Mm.
you can imagine.
Right.
So till 1913, he didn't join the Muslim League. Even in 1913, the Muslim League with a specific purpose. He was a member of the Congress as well.
Mm.
Uh, Gokhale and others actually said, go into the Muslim League and bring it closer to the Congress party. And that is, in essence, 1916, he managed to bring them on the same platform and that sort of thing. He ultimately did get the Lucknow Pact passed. But till 1913, he really saw, because remember, till 1913, League was a loyalist party. It
Mm.
didn't have self-rule as its objective.
Right.
It didn't want self government for India. 1913, Jinnah made it a precondition to his joining the
Mm.
Muslim League. He made it a precondition that Muslim League would change its manifesto and say we are now committed to self government for Indians in India.
Mm.
And so that is what clinched it for Jinnah, and he became a member of the Muslim League.
Absolutely. And as you rightly pointed out, Mr. Jinnah denounced the Muslim League when it was first formed. And yet it is quite ironic that there's so many conspiracy theories going around that later on in life, the creation of Pakistan itself was just to act as a buffer state between India and Russia, etc. And so that's quite interesting how things can go full circle. So, okay, so moving on from 1913, Yasser, I think that now is a good time to actually introduce one of the three women that have been very influential on Mr. Jinnah. As you mentioned in the book, that there are three, his wife Rathi, his sister Fatima, and his daughter Dina. So I believe it's 1916 when she was around 16 years of age, and Mr. Jinnah was probably 40 at the time. That was the time when they had first met, and so that was the start of their courtship, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, that is.
absolutely. So, how big of an influence did Rati have, his future wife, on Mr. Jinnah as a person, as well as his political ideology and the way that he saw and his particular worldview? Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about that, her influence?
I think what brought Jinnah and Rathi together, Rathi was pretty much, in that sort of, he was being Jinnah. He was very much an Indian nationalist, became, sort of, and remember Jinnah with Rathi, she was sort of someone who was very involved in politics. She was only 16, she turned 18, she married Jinnah. But throughout their marriage, even though there were problems, one of the things that kept Jinnah and Rathi together was this idea that India or Jinnah's Indian nationalist politics was pretty much them together. And so they complemented each other. I mean, with the whole thing that happened with Lord Wellington, the protests against Lord Wellington in 1918, you see Rathi right there with Jinnah on the stage with him fighting for this cause. So she was an Indian. I think as long as she lived, Jinnah had never entertained this idea of Muslim separatism. I think that might have been one of those. Her death for him was probably one of those blows that did contribute to a certain level in his sort of eventual disenchantment. So we can't separate the personal from political. I think that was a major issue for him. This idea that he had become, he had been, uh, because he did blame himself for Rathi's death because he thought, that he had been too and had not been able to take care of her. And then, of course, the age gap. I think the age gap was just humongous if you think about it. 24 years, it's a large age gap. I mean, they got married when Jinnah was 42 and she was 18. Uh, though it was common, I mean, it was a common thing back then, but it's still, for two educated people as Jinnah and Rathi were, the age gap was, and Jinnah commented to one of his friends. He later said that I probably shouldn't have married her because she was just a child, which
Mhm.
is true. So I think as let me just put it very simply. Had Rati lived, and she was a very smart and intelligent person, had she lived, Jinnah would not have become a Muslim separatist.
Hmm.
he would not have gone for a Muslim nation state.
Hmm.
Uh, Whatever, however justified his latter stances were, but had Rathi been there, he wouldn't, because once Rathi went out of the picture, it was Fatima Jinnah who, this other extraordinary woman. She was an extraordinary person, and later on, as you know, in Pakistan, she played an important part in Pakistani politics as well. But when it came to sort of this identity, she was very much, this Muslim person who saw herself as a Muslim, and so she had an influence on Jinnah as well. So I think it's very interesting to look at the women in Jinnah's life,
Right.
much epitomize his Indian nationalist phase, and Fatima being sort of his closest confidant and companion during the Muslim nationalist phase.
Absolutely, and I think that yes, the best thing I loved about the book was how you managed to integrate Mr. Jinnah's political career and his private sphere together to give a holistic, three-dimensional picture of the man, and to show how the women who were there in his life had an influence on him and his political ideology. So I think that this is, granted that I haven't read every single biography out there on Mr. Jinnah, but I'm pretty sure that this is probably something that is new in your book with regards to having these two worlds colliding and presented together. And I think that you do that really well, and that's probably been one of the highlights for me. We'll just end with one very quick, cute story about Ruthie and Mr. Jinnah. I think you mentioned in the book or in some of your interviews that he actually got him to shave off his mustache as well. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. I think, I mean, speculating, I think Mrs. Jinnah didn't appreciate kissing must, as it were. That's. I'm sorry if I've said something that is not entirely PG, but that's what I think it was.
Absolutely. Well, I think that in here lies the lesson from Mr. Jinnah that it's always, always listen to your wife and your spouse, etc. And so you'll have a really happy marriage that way. So I think that's a wonderful lesson from Mr. Jinnah, with regards to how to treat or how to listen to your wife and spouse. So Yasser, before we move on from the death of Rathi in 1929, let's backtrack a little bit, just a little bit, a couple of years, and talk about Mr. Gandhi. And as we all know, that Mr. Gandhi spent a significant amount of his life in South Africa before he returned to India. And usually, the impression we get is that he suddenly appeared and burst on the scene and became a superstar. But in your book, you mentioned that they were, in fact, Mr. Jinnah and Mr. Gandhi were actually in regular correspondence before he had come to India. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about their relationship and how well did they get along, and did they actually like each other, and how far apart were they with regards to their political ideologies?
I think the Jinnah Gandhi is very interesting. I mean, at sort of one point, they're complete polar opposites if you think about it. Jinnah being this anglicized, westernized, modern, secular person, whereas Gandhi being very much that, even off, as you know, he was also very anglicized, but ultimately had become this religious Mahatma, as it were. And I think that was their sore point. One of the things that happened very early on, not that, I mean, other historians and biographers have sort of grasped on this and said that that was probably one of those points where Gandhi and Jinnah relationship got off to a sour note. When Gandhi came back to the subcontinent, Jinnah was the person who actually welcomed him, and there was a part by the Gujar Sabha where Jinnah presided over it. And Gandhi was when Gandhi came to that meeting, and when it was his turn to speak, he famously said that I'm so glad that that I'm so glad that minority Mohammedan is presiding over this meeting. And I think Jinnah being typecasted into that Muslim minority bit was something that Jinnah took very, obviously it was an unkind cut for Jinnah because he had seen himself as an Indian nationalist, and pretty much, other than the fact that his name was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, He couldn't see anything Muslim about himself. Point, he was very much hurt by what Gandhi said, but I don't think there were other things as well. I think that might have been one of those points which Jinnah took offense to. But I think the main breaking point came with the Khilafat movement.
mm,
Uh, Jinnah saw first, obviously, Jinnah also saw that Gandhi was bringing religion into politics by going around as this figure who's using religion, talking about ahimsa, satyagraha. He could have he might as well have used other more secular language for the same concepts, but he didn't. And but what was the main breaking point was the fact that Gandhi started quoting the reactionary religious
yeah,
mullahs in the Muslim community. And that was along, the lines of the Khilafat movement, where Khilafat was an emotive issue. And Jinnah also, went and spoke to the British about it. But making common cause with sort of the religious groups within the Muslim community was something that Jinnah found something that, as a secular Indian nationalist, he was of the view that that was pretty much something that would ultimately lead to a break between Hindus and Muslims. And that is kind of what happened. So we saw with the Mopla uprising and the violence between Hindus and Muslims that followed subsequently after the Khilafat movement was discontinued. So I think Jinnah very much said, I don't have anything to do, I won't have anything to do with this religious approach to politics. And, bringing religion into politics is a problem. So I think that was sort of their initial break, and they pretty much Jinnah, left the Congress party in 1920 because, he said that he could not support the non-cooperation movement, especially when it was based on such premises as religion, as sort of emotive appeals and that sort of thing, because he believed in this constitutional way of doing politics. He believed that the way forward for India was constitutional advance, where India would become a self-governing dominion within the British Empire and ultimately move to freedom, as it were. But he was pretty much working within this constitutional framework, and that was something that Gandhi was unwilling to do. So that is why they kind of broke away. Of course, they were polar opposites in other ways. As I said, he was, from a different world altogether. He was, Jinnah was, sort of this anglicized, very British, and someone who's seen as a sellout by a lot of his compatriots, because he was considered more British than the British when it came to sort of his, the way he dressed and stuff. But this didn't mean that he was, in any way in awe of the British. The reason why he was, I mean, this needs to be clarified. The reason why Jinnah dressed and, was this man about town, as it were, it was because he wanted to be equal. He didn't want to be seen as someone who was somehow lower than the British. So I think that is something that played an important part in his psyche. And I think Gandhi could not appreciate that, because Gandhi was pretty much about, sort of this nativist cultural relativism. And that was what defined his politics. So I think there were,
mm,
I think the differences we can see, one, the use of religion in politics, and two, constitutional means that Jinnah wanted, which Gandhi was unable or unwilling to abide by.
mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll just backtrack just a little bit, and for our viewers and listeners who may not be aware of what the Khilafat movement was. So I'll try to explain it a little bit in a rudimentary way, Yasser, and please feel free to correct me if I get it wrong. So, as per my understanding, the Ottoman Empire was the Muslim Caliphate, which they had taken over around the 1500s from the Arabs, and the Caliphate, obviously, the Khilafat slash Caliphate is the political succession to the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad. And so in 1918, when Turkey was on the wrong side of the First World War, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and the Young Turks, etc., and all the political parties decided to do away with the caliphate and create a secular Turkish republic. Uh, Hence, the reason why there was a Khilafat movement in India, and to try and revive or to continue the caliphate, more or less. Have I got that right? Yeah.
Well, more or less, I think the thing that Muslims feared very early on was that even the British would try and undo the Khilafat,
Yeah.
which actually wasn't true. It was the nationalist Turks who were trying to undo the Khilafat under
Mm,
Kemal Ataturk,
right.
and
Right.
those nationalist Turks found a lot of support in modernist Muslims of the subcontinent and secular-minded individuals like Jinnah. They
Mm.
supported Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. So there was that, yes.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. So hence, so I think it's important to have explained that to our viewers and listeners. But I do find it very interesting that Mr. Gandhi had supported the Khilafat movement and Mr. Jinnah opposed it. So that really shows where his headspace was and what he was thinking and what
Mhm.
his political ideology was. Now, Yasser, before moving on to the next question, let's take just a little bit to talk about the other renowned figure in this, with regards to Mr. Jinnah and Mr. Gandhi, the third person in the trio, Mr. Nehru. In the book, I will say that Mr. Nehru, he sort of comes across as the primary antagonist, and I don't mean it in a bad way. He sort of comes across as the primary rival, you could say, to Mr. Jinnah. And I wanted to get your thoughts on what do you think could be the reasons why they didn't always see eye to eye or not get along? Could it be that Mr. Nehru thought that Mr. Jinnah was just this snooty upstart man from a aristocratic family, etc. But as we already discussed, he didn't come from that kind of family. He was a very middle class guy, and so you'd expect that they would both have a lot of things in common. So what is your take on the relationship between Mr. Nehru and Mr. Jinnah?
I think there was a personality clash there as well. Much more so, much more pronounced than Gandhi. Because remember, Nehru and Jinnah would, logically one would they would agree on a lot more than Gandhi and Jinnah, or even Gandhi and Nehru. I mean, both men saw the world in sort of secular terms. They were not very religious, and they were coming. But the problem with I think Nehru himself answers this question very well, and I think that is something that needs to be read. Nehru's discovery of India. He talks about Jinnah at length, and he says that Jinnah was this advanced Muslim leader who was so far ahead of Muslims, but nevertheless was someone who was behind the Congress ideals of. He was not exactly in terms of mass movement, in terms of sort of agitation against the British. Jinnah was just not on board because he was a constitutionalist. So I think there was that, and Nehru, remember, was himself he was from an aristocratic Brahmin family.
Mm, right.
And so he did see Jinnah as an upstart, as it were,
Mm,
and an intellectually inferior person. I think Nehru considered Jinnah very much an intellectual inferior to him. And so that was something that set the tone for their relationship. I think we see their relationship in full bloom or lack thereof. We see when they interact in 1937, 1938 in the aftermath of the polls. I think the arrogance with which, and Nehru was a great man, no doubt, but his approach to Jinnah was very arrogant. And while interestingly, though Jinnah himself didn't have a very high sort of, he didn't hold Nehru in high esteem, as it were, but Jinnah actually did try and appease Nehru on several occasions by trying to extend him this olive branch, as it were.
mm,
But Nehru, I think, was pretty much into this thing where he saw Jinnah as this useless appendage of the British Empire, as it were, who was using these communal issues to retard the growth of Indian nationalism. So pretty much what Jinnah had accused the Muslim leaders of doing in 1906 was what Nehru was accusing Jinnah of doing in 1938.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was the thing. So Nehru had pretty much occupied the place that Jinnah had occupied in 1906. Nehru now occupied it. Remember, there was an age gap as well, about 13 odd years or so.
Right. Yes, I believe they had a 7 year age gap, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I think there was,
1876.
I think it was a 13-year gap.
Between Mr. Jinnah and Mr. Nehru.
Yes, Nehru was 13 years younger.
Okay. Um, okay, sure. Um, okay, so I assume that maybe he was born in 1883, but I could be mistaken. So yeah, I'll
1889.
definitely take your word.
1889. Yeah, Nehru was born in 1889.
85. Right. Okay. All right. So now, Yasser, we've pretty much covered everything from pre 1937. So now let's fast forward a little bit to post 1937. If we went right into 19, let's say 47, 48, when we're coming to the end of the First World War in 1945, sorry, Second World War in 1945. After that, the British Empire is on its last legs, and so the colonies are clamoring for independence, and so the independence movement is in full swing. And by this time, Mr. Jinnah has also fully committed himself to the idea of Pakistan and the two-nation theory. And so the question I would have is that with regards to the partition plan itself, and his the dealings that were going on between Mr. Jinnah, Mr. Nehru, and Lord Mountbatten. Uh, just give us a flavor of what those discussions were about and how was it unfolding, and was Lord Mountbatten actually more partial towards Mr. Nehru at the expense of Mr. Jinnah? Do please walk us through that.
I think Mountbatten was definitely he was very partial towards Nehru and against Jinnah, and at Jinnah's expense for that matter. I think that comes out very clearly in terms of when every time there was a plan that came out, there was the famous Plan Balkan that came out earlier. Mountbatten would run to Nehru and show him the plan before he would show it to anyone else. So I think there was that personal equation between Nehru and Mountbatten. People have speculated as to why that was, but they were very close friends. So I think that there was that. I think the major issue between Mountbatten, Nehru, and Jinnah was about the partition of Punjab and Bengal.
Mhm.
Now, Jinnah was dead set against partition of Punjab and Bengal. He believed, and this might sound ironic, but he could justify it. He believed that a Punjabi Muslim or a Hindu or a Sikh, or for that matter, a Bengali Hindu or a Muslim, were Punjabis and Bengalis before they were Muslims or Hindus or
Mhm.
Sikhs for that matter. And so Mountbatten responded to this by saying, look, if that is the case, then a Muslim or a Hindu or a Sikh are Muslims or Hindus are Indians before they're Hindus, Muslims, or Sikhs. So therefore, there shouldn't be a partition at all. If you don't want partition of Punjab and Bengal, you should apply that principle to India as well. And that was sort of the debate which went on. It was, kind of an endless circular debate that they were engaged in. So that was between Mountbatten and Jinnah. Nehru, I think, was pretty much, playing. He was the puppet master in this debate, and puppet being obviously Mountbatten himself. And then you had Gandhi. Also, the Gandhi factor was playing in the background. But so that was, I think, the flavor of it would be that Gandhi, Mountbatten, Nehru, and to some extent Gandhi were pretty much trying to bulldoze Jinnah into this moth-eaten, truncated Pakistan, which ultimately is what Jinnah got. So
Mhm. Absolutely. Just before moving ahead with 1948, I would like to just backtrack a couple of months and talk about an alternative plan that was proposed by the Premier of Bengal, Mr. Hussein Shahid Shorwardi, whom, as you know, is a very revered figure in Bangladesh. And so I had presumed that before reading your book, I had presumed that the United Bengal plan that Mr. Shorwardi had proposed was actually shot down by Mr. Jinnah himself and the Muslim League. And because they didn't want to have an independent Bengal, they wanted it to be part of Pakistan. But in fact, it was actually the Congress Party who had vetoed it, and Mr. Jinnah was in fact supportive of it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, the United Bengal plan, and why it did not go through to fruition?
The United Bengal was definitely something one which I was surprised by when I read about it a long time ago. Uh, Shorevardi and Sarat Chandra Bose of the Congress came together and they presented this plan. The Congress party didn't want this, and the reason was twofold. One, the Hindus of Bengal, as it were didn't want to live as a perpetual minority in a Bengal state. So that was one reason it was shot down. And the other reason was that basically this would have led to a balkanization. That's what Nehru and Congress party feared, that ultimately it would lead to the balkanization of India. That every small state would say, but there was actually a very legitimate case for Bengal becoming an independent state, and Jinnah was all in favor of it. He said, taking out Calcutta from Bengal in any event is a problem. If you're going to give in East Pakistan or East Bengal without Calcutta, that would be problematic, as it was initially. Now Bangladesh has done really well, but back in the day, Calcutta was everything. And so Jinnah pretty much wanted a united Bengal state, and he believed that that united Bengal state would be very friendly to Pakistan. He didn't expect too many problems there. And so he supported the idea of a united Bengal. Congress party, like I said, was opposed to it for its own reasons. Its constituents said, no, we don't want to live as perpetual minorities, and that making a Bengal state would then open up the door to other smaller states
Right.
asking for independence as well.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that that really puts it very succinctly. So it really was a surprise for me, and I'm glad to see it was a surprise for you as well when you read about that. So yes, thank you so much. Now, Yasser, at the moment we're discussing 1947, 48. Okay, so 1947. So August 14th, August 15th, Pakistan have come into fruition as two dominion states. Um, the Mr. Jinnah had envisioned that the dominions would be Pakistan and Hindustan, and India would be something that was above both. And he had something similar to the US Canada model in mind, where both the US and Canada have such friendly relations with each other that he envisioned Hindustan and Pakistan to have open borders and cross pollination. But because one is a Hindu majority state and the other is a Muslim majority state, both dominions would be on their best behavior with regards to treating their minorities properly,
Mhm.
right? So
Yes.
where did that how did that kind of go awry? What I mean is, how is it that the name India was, for lack of a better word, usurped by the Union of India, and they didn't adopt Hindustan as the name,
I think where
whereas
it was
Pakistan, called itself Pakistan.
Nehru pretty much said that since Pakistan is a seceding state, we should keep the name India. Now, India, as you know, comes from the Indus, which flows through Pakistan. So Jinnah was very clear. He said, there can't be an India without Pakistan.
Mm.
Jinnah actually wanted, if you look at the cabinet mission plan, one of the sort of the ideas that he had in mind was a confederation between Pakistan and Hindustan, a confederation of India. That obviously didn't come into fruition. But yes, ultimately he saw Pakistan and India being like US, Canada, and also keeping it their minorities, in sort of. So I don't want to use the word hostage, but in terms of that's a very indelicate way of putting the whole issue. But they believe that since both states would have minorities, they would treat each other's minorities well, and that would ultimately bring together both parties on the same table, and they would work together as two nations living in the subcontinent, and working towards a common goal, with probably a joint defense pact and that sort of thing. But this didn't happen primarily, and I blame Pakistan for it, because even though we entered into the Liaquat Nehru Pact in 1951, which pretty much established that 1950. Sorry, Liaquat Nehru Pact was in 1950. It
Mhm.
pretty much established the principle that minorities would be treated equally, and that equally on both sides. And that was pretty much a pact that went back to the Lahore Resolution, which spoke about the same sort of understanding between Pakistan and India, or whatever the successive states were. So I think what Pakistan did increasingly after 1956, when it became an Islamic republic, but 1956 was still a better situation. Slowly and steadily, minorities have been marginalized in Pakistan, and I think that's given, um, sort of the other side, as it were, Indians, an out, as it were, from their own, because Indian constitution is secular and it does promise equal rights to minorities. But we see what's going on in India right now. So
That's
yeah,
right.
I think the partition plan could have worked. The whole Pakistan India thing could have worked for the better had there been some sort of a link between Pakistan and India, and that would be sort of a treaty arrangement or a constitutional arrangement. Unfortunately, that didn't come into.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yes. And so now we've just gone past August 1947. And so the next question that I have, Yasser, will be a little sensitive. And I do hope that I'm able to word it properly because of the sensitivity of it with regards to East Bengal, East Pakistan and Bangladesh. As you know that Mr. Jinnah had arrived in Dhaka in March 1948, and he had a speech given where he mentioned that Urdu would be the only state language of Pakistan. And so that kind of had some repercussions, as it led to the birth of the Bengali language movement, and perhaps that was the seed that germinated into Bengali nationalism, which by 1971 ultimately led to the secession of East Pakistan and the birth of Bangladesh. And so my question to you would be that how do we best understand what Mr. Jinnah's 1948 speech was about, and how do you look at it as a historian? What was Mr. Jinnah trying to say, and how was it interpreted by the people who were listening to it?
Mhm. I think it's important to, and this is something that's usually missed out. It's important to say that it was state language, which is the lingua franca. Jinnah was not saying it was a national language. He said, and this is a position that, by the way, was kind of dictated to Jinnah. I think Liaquat Ali Khan, I was reading in one of the Constituent Assembly debates, Liaquat Ali Khan's position was that anyone who's trying to create this issue is actually trying to harm Pakistan. So pretty much the whole narrative of, if you say this, you're a fifth columnist and that sort of thing. And Jinnah kind of ran with it. You see, it was not just, so his problem, I think, was that, I mean, on a logical plane, I mean, you're looking at it from, sort of state formation business. You're like, okay, fine, there should be one state language, which would be official language, which would replace English language, and that might as well be Urdu because that's kind of understood by the elites everywhere. Now, the people within Jinnah's cabinet, especially people like, and not just cabinet, but other Muslim leaders like Khwaja Nazmuddin, for example, convinced Jinnah that Urdu would be accepted by the Bengali populace, and that making Bengali the provincial language of East Pakistan, or East Bengal, as it were, would be enough. So I think pretty much that is where Jinnah was coming from. Because remember now, for example, Pakistan is a federation, and Punjab is the largest province in Pakistan. It has, it's not just the largest province, it's the largest population as well. 52% of the country is Punjabi.
Hmm.
So some would argue that Punjabi should be the national language of Pakistan because it's the majority, but it is a provincial language. So I think that was the debate: the provinces versus federation. That there should be one state language, not a national language, uh, and there would be provincial languages for each province, as it were. And that is what Liaquat Ali Khan. That was the position that Liaquat Ali Khan took in the Constituent Assembly. Jinnah went to Dhaka and just defended that policy, which was already in place in Karachi, the capital.
Mhm. Understood. And just staying with this point, Yasser, and this is just for my knowledge and for anybody else who may not, who may also be curious. Um, is it true that Urdu was spoken by only 7% of the population in the West, or was it more widely spoken?
Well, it was 7% of as a native language.
Mm.
Um,
As a
but
native language. Okay.
Urdu is understood. I mean, you see, if you think about it, I mean, North India, right from Peshawar to sort of Bengal,
Yeah.
had, when under British rule, used Urdu as, and then to some extent Hindi as the language of courts.
Mm.
Therefore, it was pretty much this lingua franca, and we're talking about Urdu, Hindi, Hindustani, any iteration of that particular Prakrit-based language that is known as Khadi Boli. That is pretty much spoken from and understood right up to Calcutta. I'm sure people in Dhaka also understand it. I mean, I'm sure you watch Indian films and that sort of thing, so you would kind of get what that language is, what is being said. So I think that was what where these people were coming from. I think the language was spoken by the elites in all these provinces. And Punjab, for example, which was a Punjabi dominated state, Punjabi dominated province, was had Urdu as its language of courts and that sort of thing. So pretty much it was spoken and understood by most people in the West. I'm
Mm.
not entirely sure about the East, though.
Right. Yeah, yeah, and with your permission, I'll just elaborate a little bit more on what I think might have been happening on this side. Um, I believe that Bengali was actually being taught in the schools, and hence the regional languages that we have in Bangladesh, like for example Sylheti or Chatgaya, which are classified as dialects, are actually languages in and of themselves. So suppose a Chittagonian and a Sylheti, when they talk to each other, they will not use their native language, which is the Sylheti and the Chatgaya language. They will communicate in Bengali, which is actually the link language. And so I think that this is probably, I've tried to make sense of it for a very long time, and I probably don't have all the answers. But what I assume happened is that, whenever when we talk about the Bengali language movement, the slogan in Bengali is Rashtra Bhasha Bangla Chai, which means that we want the state language to be Bengali. And the reason we want it to be Bengali is because if you were to put in another language like Urdu, which isn't actually maybe as widely spoken in this part of the world, we will not be able to compete, with people who are already accustomed to speaking it. And this is probably very similar to what is happening in present day in India, where you have the north-south divide, where the Hindi belt is up there, and you have the southern languages. And so, and especially the people of Tamil Nadu who say that, why should we have Hindi as a link language? Why not have English? Because that makes it a level playing field for everyone when they're trying to look for jobs and opportunities. We know that English is a foreign language, and hence everybody who wants to, promote their own mother tongue, or whatever, will not be at a advantage. So I think that maybe equity and disadvantage, and so it's a whole topic in and of itself, and we won't dwell too much on it. But yes, I think that
I would like to say that, in retrospect, if you
yeah,
think about it, I don't know what Mr. Jinnah was thinking at the time, but it was a mistake.
yeah,
I think he should have stuck to his, because at the very, if you look at the Constituent Assembly debates
hmm,
in 1947, when he presides over the assembly, he says, English should be the language that is yet should be spoken. Unless you don't understand English, then you can speak in other languages in the Constituent Assembly.
hmm,
So I think that is something that Jinnah should have promoted throughout. So it was in retrospect a great mistake on part of Mr. Jinnah to insist on Urdu being the only state language.
hmm,
But I think the reasons we can see, there were reasons, as you said, it was, they considered, the Muslim leaguers considered it to be the link language and also the language of Muslims, as it were,
right,
because they saw that Urdu had been such a central part of, sort of central part of the Indian Muslim struggle, especially with 1937 onwards. Urdu was seen as this language of Muslims and that sort of thing. So there was that. I think this interesting question of English should have remained the official language and it would have kept Pakistan united, I think,
hmm,
uh, to a certain extent. Provided if say, because it was not just the language issue that divided Pakistan and Bangladesh, right? It was also things like systematic economic exploitation
Right.
and denial of, because in 1965 Bengalis by and large voted for Fatima Jinnah, you know, as the and so there was a major sort of, so I think that is something that as far as Pakistan is concerned, I think English language would have served the purpose. But Aga Khan, interestingly,
Mhm.
said that Arabic should be the national language of Pakistan.
Mhm.
Thankfully, that proposal wasn't accepted.
Yes, it would have been interesting to see how that would have worked out. But yes,
Yes.
I do agree with you on perhaps English could have remained as the link language because it would have made a level playing field for everybody because it wasn't native to any one particular community. So yes, so we'll leave the language question at that, Yasser. Thank you so much for your feedback on this, and I really enjoyed discussing this particular question because I know how much it means to our viewers and listeners, in Bangladesh as well as the Bengali diaspora. And I'm quite sure that, this will also be very interestingly received by everybody who's watching us and listening to us from Pakistan. So, Yasser, we've actually gone a little bit over time. So, with your permission, I'll take just a little bit more of your time and ask you a couple of staple questions which we have on the show, and that is that if you were to, as you know, that because we are a book-related podcast, so one of the questions that we actually love to ask our guests, and we're always told that it's a really tough question, so we always give our guests enough time to think about it a little bit. So the question is that if you were to recommend a book that you feel that, let's say, every young person should read, or of any age level, doesn't have to be a book on history or politics or even law, what would be that one particular book that you feel that everybody should read at least once in their lifetime?
That is a difficult question. I actually did look at that question and do a double take, because in terms of history, it's very clear. If you're a Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or an Indian, the book that you should be reading is Aisha Jalal's Soul Spokesman. So that I'm quite clear about. It kind of explains what partition is all about. But in terms of a general book, I think I'm going to give the Gandhian answer. You know, Gandhi famously said that that should be the King James Bible.
Okay.
So read the King James Bible. No, but I like a number of books. I read a lot of fiction and that sort of thing. I think, but in terms of, there's this one book. I mean, that's a very hard question. So I don't know what that would be. But in terms of history, I would say Soul Spokesman would be important. But I'm sure your audience is wider than the subcontinent.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Well, that's fine. We'll take your answer as it is, and yes, I'm yet to find a guest who hasn't silently condemned me for asking this question because it is so difficult. But we've had a lot of interesting answers, and we do thank you for taking the time to think so thoroughly about what you feel would be a good book for everybody to read. So, Yasser, you mentioned that you love reading fiction. So, are you more of a fiction person or a non-fiction person? What kind of books does Barrister Yasser Latif Hamdani like to read? So please tell us.
Well, I like fiction that is also historical. So, I read a lot of C.J. Sansom. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He
Mm-hmm.
does a lot of 16th century murder mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
And
Historical.
interestingly,
Right.
since you said barrister, the central person in that, sort of the one person that the whole story revolves around is Lincoln's Inn barrister, Matthew Shardlake. So I think that's something that I would want to recommend to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
C.J. Sansom's Matthew Shardlake series. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's brilliant. So I like that, and that's sort of a guilty pleasure that I indulge in. I do read a lot of fiction, much law-related fiction as well. John Grisham and that sort of thing. So,
John Grisham, yeah, and that's wonderful. So yes, I think that you do your profession no harm by recommending books that have something to do with law. So yes, thank you so much for that, Yasser. And so Yasser, we I before our interview, and given how as I mentioned, Titanic a figure Mr. Jinnah was, I did actually solicit some questions from a lot of friends and family members from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh alike. And with your permission, I would like to ask you just one or two questions from that group. I want to do justice to them for the time they gave in sending in their questions just for this episode, because they were really excited about this particular episode and the fact that we'd be talking. But before I get to those questions, I have a surprise guest question from somebody whom you know very well, and it was the list of questions that I had sent you earlier. And the person asking this question is Dr. Emran El-Badawi from
Oh,
one of your friends from Rutgers University, who is now with the University of Houston, and he's the chair of modern languages at the University of Houston, and he's written a couple of books. One of his books, which I really loved, was The Quran and the Aramaic Gospel Traditions. And I think he has two more books that came out recently. One was Communities in the Quran, and the third one was Queens and Prophets. But the question that he asks is, and I'm reading this out verbatim. Greetings to my old friend, now an accomplished attorney, author, and family man, Yasser Latif Hamdani. I have always known you to be an ardent fighter for justice and lover of Pakistan, including its founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. What is it about him as a person that you identify with, resonates with you, or motivates you? In essence, I'm asking about the personal connection between author and subject. So, yes, that's the question from Dr. Imran Al Badawi.
well, I think first of all, great surprise. Imran was always one of my, one of the people I really admired uh, back. He was such an interesting, had such interesting insights and that sort of thing. But yeah, his question. I think the personal connection between Jinnah and myself, of course, is this idea that where you're between worlds, as it were. You're kind of uh, you're educated, then you're educated abroad, and that sort of thing. So um, it's something that I think gives you a. So the fact that Jinnah was the founding father of the nation, but he was also I see for myself, I see a lot of sort of similarities in the sense that he was someone who had gone to the West at a very early age, had confronted the identity issues, minority within a minority, so that sort of thing does appeal to a person like myself. I traveled to the US when I was 18 years of age, and just had come of age there. And coming of age in the West is an experience, as you can imagine. And so Jinnah, definitely there's that connection. This this feeling of being divided between worlds, the Western world and sort of the East. So I think that there was that which was fascinating about Jinnah, but also the identity question. I think Jinnah was such a central master signifier, as it were, for Pakistani identity. That without answering that question, you can't. I believe that you can't go forward and develop an identity in Pakistan, which is which is acceptable to the world, right? I mean, we are talking about an identity of Pakistani. You can't perpetually be at war with the world, which is what I fear many of my compatriots are, in terms of ideologically being at war. So I think Jinnah definitely presented a path, or sort of was, is a way of looking at things that I think is not always appreciated by Pakistanis. And this is something that I said earlier as well. I think answering the Jinnah puzzle, or solving the Jinnah puzzle, as it were, is so important for identity issues. So I think that was the personal connection.
Absolutely. And I think that's really well said, Yasser. So thank you so much for that. Now, Yasser, there's one more question that I think that we can probably end with. And this question actually comes from a friend of mine who is from the Pakistani Ahmadiyya community, and I know that you're extremely you've been extremely no, what's the right word, vocal, or very passionate about the rights of minorities, just like Mr. Jinnah was. And so I think it's really a great testament to all the great work that you have done. And so I think that this one particular community tends to get marginalized so much. So it is only fair that we have at least one question from this community that is being set forth to you. And the question is that as an author who has dedicated a significant amount of time to researching and writing about Mr. Jinnah, what do you personally take away from his life and legacy, and why do you think it continues to be relevant and significant to people today? So that's the question from a friend of mine.
Well, I think, like you said, Jinnah did stand for minorities, and he was very, very forthright about the fact that he would have. And one of the things he said was that a country that was founded by a minority cannot be unmindful of its minorities within it. So that was something that played a part in his makeup when it came to sort of talking about Pakistan and its future. So I think that is a key takeaway. Remember with Ahmadis, and I think this needs to be repeated again and again. In 1944, there was this immense pressure that was brought on Jinnah to actually turn out the Ahmadis from the Muslim League. He refused to do that. He said, if someone calls himself a Muslim, is a Muslim, you know, and that is precisely the right that Pakistani state has taken away from the Ahmadi community. So I think it's a major, it's a stab in Jinnah's Pakistan's heart, if you think about it. The fact that Ahmadis in Pakistan not only are declared non-Muslim by the state, but they can't even profess to be Muslims. So I think when we talk about Jinnah, we talk about these things. The fact that he stood for this inclusive, democratic state where religion would be a personal matter. I think that is a very relevant thing for Pakistani state right now, because that is something that the Pakistani state hasn't quite reckoned with, right? It's not come to terms with the fact that there can be a Muslim majority state that is also secular in nature. And I think in that case, in that way, I think Bangladesh is a great example for Pakistan, right? I mean, if you think about it, because you have a Muslim majority state that hasn't, for example, declared Ahmadis non-Muslims, right? And even though that's the problems are the same, so I think Jinnah remains relevant in Pakistan just to answer that question.
Absolutely. And just staying with that point, Yasser, and if you'll allow me, I'll obviously having read your book and having a better picture, a clearer picture of the real historical Mr. Jinnah, away from the hagiographic portraits that we have and going around. I came to a conclusion which I would like to share with you, which is that if Mr. Jinnah was alive today, he may well have considered Bangladesh and not Pakistan as it currently exists in this current iteration as the real manifestation of his vision for Pakistan. Would you agree with that statement?
I absolutely agree. I think Bangladesh, as it stands today, it's not an Islamic republic. I don't think, as far as I've read, Jinnah, I don't think he would have endorsed an Islamic republic. And remember, Pakistan is at this point is no more than just an Islamic republic. It's a full blown theocracy.
Theocracy. Right.
So that's something that Jinnah would not, have appreciated in the first. So I think definitely with Bangladesh, where Bangladesh is today, economically prosperous, stable, democratic state, which hasn't had military coups for a long time, a stable government, that is something that Jinnah would have endorsed. And that kind of, is, I mean, it goes back to another issue that I was thinking about when I was, I knew I was going to come on your show, was, how close Mujibur Rahman's relationship was to the Muslim League and to the making of Pakistan. I read memoirs of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and he was a passionate worker in the Pakistan movement, you know. And I think I think Jinnah would have definitely endorsed the Bangladesh that Mujibur Rahman made. I think, that is something that, and as far as Pakistan is concerned, unfortunately, it is for now in the terrible state. I mean, it's not only is it a theocracy, but unfortunately, one is forced to say that it is a bankrupt state. I mean, we are perpetually standing at the edge of default, and so that sort of thing was not what Jinnah expected Pakistan would be. So.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for that, Yasser, because I think that our viewers and listeners in Bangladesh will be very heartened to hear all the good things that you've had to say about Bangladesh and of course, the special relationship that Fatima Jinnah had with Bangladeshi Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the father of the nation, and and these familiar ties in these links will, of course, all hope a very prosperous South Asia, which includes India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and hope for prosperity for all the people of the Indian Indo-Pak subcontinent. And so Yasser, we've gone way over time, and I really want to be respectful of your time as well. Thank you once again for coming onto the show. I'll just quickly grab the book, which is right behind me, and show it to our viewers and listeners. The book is called Jinnah A Life by Yasser Latif Hamdani. Please go out and buy the book. It's a fantastic book written by a fabulous author. And as I said, that the perspective that Yasser brings to the book is because he himself is a barrister, a lawyer, and Mr. Jinnah was also a lawyer. And so that particular aspect of the book is something that is really a treat to read. So, Yasser, just before we conclude, are there any new projects that you're working on that you would like to put in a plug for? Any new books that are in the pipeline, or anything new that you're up to
Yeah,
these days? Please let us know.
I think so. I think I'm, kind of toying with the idea of writing, a more holistic story of two nation theory as well as the idea of a theocracy in Pakistan. How was it that this idea of two nation theory got entangled with this idea of a theocracy? And look at the constitutions. I would be looking at the constitutions of 1954, which was never enacted, and 1956, which was, and then going forward to 1973 when Pakistani constitution was made. So I'm actually working on that now.
Hmm. Absolutely. And how soon can we expect? Can your fans and readers expect to see that project to fruition?
Yes, it's right now in infancy, so I wouldn't sort of put a timeline on it, but I think it'll be a year or so. So
A year or so. Okay, so and we'll wait with a bated breath for that to come out because I've really enjoyed this book so much that I'm planning to read your other books that came out previously. And so we really look forward to this next episode to continue the life of Mr. Jinnah as well as the history of the Indian subcontinent. So once again, Barrister Yasser Latif Hamdani, sir, thank you so much for your time. You've been a wonderful guest, and I've loved talking to you. And I really hope to have you back on Book Cafe podcast once again for a future episode. Thank you so
thank
much.
you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.